Thank you so much. Maybe that's a good place to start, of thanking you all for the support for the survey. Many of you have completed it. We couldn't have got it out into people's hands without Heads Department and all colleagues who got it, passing it on and talking about it. So it's a really positive thing that we've got such a good engagement with it. So my name's Tom. I'm from the University of Warwick. The whole team are here behind the State of the Discipline survey. I think it's really good to be here today, and for the particular reason that we have got this really rich picture of the discipline which came out of the survey. It's a mixed methods piece. There are huge numbers of items in it, and we focus a lot of our attention on giving as clearly as we can this really detailed picture of so many areas of the experiences of education research and researchers. And I think this conversation about, well, what do we do about this and what do we make of it, is actually an undeveloped discussion. And so this is the discussion that needs to be had. And so what we're doing in this presentation is taking actually a little bit more of a digested, issue-focused take on some of the report. So we're trying to pull out some of the things that we think really need discussion, and it's everyone in this room who can hopefully move that conversation forward. So I'm going to provide a quick introduction to the survey, and then we're going to talk about different areas of it across the team. So I'm sure you'll be familiar with the overall picture, so I'll keep this brief and I can follow up with questions if need be. But we're looking at the state of the discipline. We're looking in particular at universities. We want to know the experiences and research going on in schools of education and education departments in particular. And we had, as a very important starting point for this, the work that had been done in the State of the Discipline Initiative, and in particular the systematic scoping report by Boyle and colleagues. So one of our key starting points was picking up this range of, it was kind of formal and informal structures and processes, and this is a description of what's going on. So we took these out and fed them into the survey, and this was one of our key starting points. The survey is really wide-ranging. We tried to cram as much as we possibly could into a 10-15 minute survey, and we've covered areas on research, what people are doing, why and how, their working conditions, their values, their identities, their personal backgrounds, and the environment they find themselves working in at both institutional and more widely. So an overview of what we've got. This was a large-scale online survey. We launched it around the spring to summer of last year. It covered all 4 UK nations. We had good representation from all. The survey went through an extensive development process. So we had, as I say, the systematic scoping review as a very strong starting point, but then we drew on many other surveys that had been done. We had excellent support from an advisory group, we had excellent support from the BERA committee, and many other colleagues who looked at it. So we had this sort of a few months period, I think it was, with some extensive development work on that survey. One of the reasons why, as well as getting this particular use of it right, we hope that there's longitudinal potential for this survey, or at least a subset of it, to be done again and again as we see the discipline evolve over time. We disseminated it. We did a very extensive scraping emails off institutional websites exercise, collecting around 8,000 emails in total. And this was simply because we wanted to reach everyone as best we could. We had support from heads of departments, from networks to share the survey. And we sent about, I think it was about 3 emails in total to just about everyone we could contact. There's a limitation there that some people don't have their emails on institutional websites, and this is in particular the case for those who are new to the sector, so on entry or on the periphery of it. It's been harder for us to reach them. We had a blog series, and we tried to target early career networks, for example, to try and address that. We had over 1,600 responses. We estimate that that's about 20% of education researchers. And in terms of representation, we've compared our overall survey statistics to the HESA data and to the previous project's work, which we're very much seeing ourselves as connecting to. We're another piece of the jigsaw in this picture that's being provided today. The survey looked incredibly representative from that perspective. When we look at gender, ethnicity, seniority, we are lining up well with the HESA data. As I say, one perhaps area of underrepresentation is those who are at the entry points or periphery of the sector. So we think there's a slight underrepresentation there. Okay, so I'm going to hand over in a moment to my colleagues. We're going to look through 4 general sections. So there's 3 substantive ones and a reflections and discussions one. But what we're going to do is we're actually going to punctuate this with short discussions after each one. So rather than front-loading everything, we're going to cover so many issues. We think it's best to pause and stop for discussion. And these could be comments, it can be questions, it can be anything that people want to say. So we'll have about 5 minutes after sections 1, 2 and 3 and put it out to the floor to talk about those things. Okay, without further ado, I'll hand over to Jess.
So in this section, I'll be presenting some of our findings as a refresher, alongside the interpretations of these findings and how these findings have also been illuminated by the personal experiences illustrated in the open forum questions that we indicated. The interesting thing to note in this section is the experiences that from people from different demographics, backgrounds, and different identities have, and how these experiences shape the permeation of inequality and how inequality is felt. When looking at identity and gender, 65% of those in the survey identified as women, 31.8% as men, 2.2% preferred not to say, and 1% identified as non-binary or an unlisted category. For the types of universities where men and women were located, we found that the workforce in lower tier universities was more likely to have a higher proportion of women at 71%, compared with middle tier and elite tier higher universities at 64% and 63.3% respectively. We saw higher proportions of younger than older women and higher proportions of older than younger men. When we examined job roles by gender, for most roles, including lecturers, senior lecturers, readers, teaching fellows, and research assistants, there is a relatively stable split between the largest groups of men and women. Men tended to hold somewhere between 23% and 30% of these roles, while women held between 65% and 72%. These figures are broadly in line with the gender split within the sector. At professorial level, however, there was a considerable shift, with nearly half of these roles being held by men at 46.1% compared with 50.9% of women, which obviously does not reflect the representation of these groups. The majority of educational researchers were of a white ethnic background at 87.4%, which reflects the findings in line with Beluigi et al. 2022. When compared with wider data on academic researchers, this was a higher proportion than across academia more generally, where 74% are reported as white. From our findings, therefore, education as an area of study has proportionally fewer Black and Asian researchers than the rest of UK academia. And these relatively low figures were reflected in our survey sample. We saw approximately similar proportions of white respondents across university tiers. Identifying as being of white ethnicity was a personal characteristic associated with more positive experiences and outcomes on many of the items within the survey when compared to the experience of other ethnic groups. There are responses in the optional qualitative reflections which pointed to how these experiences were felt by our participants, and some respondents discussed feeling invisible and the notion of scholarly neglect. With reference to research, one scholar who described herself as being a Black woman explained that she felt hyper-visible, and she explained that her identity as Black meant she was regularly called upon to relay her lived experiences of racisms and other injustices in the institution without being supported with the appropriate resources. When we look at disabilities, impairments, and health-related factors, a significant number of respondents reported having a disability, impairment, or health condition that affected their day-to-day lives. And it is worth noting here that we are particularly inclusive around that terminology. This figure relating to disability status is higher than those reported elsewhere of 6.6% in education workforce data and of 5.1% for the wider academic workforce. The findings from the open answer responses in this survey point to some academics in this area feeling like they, again, were invisible to the institution, yet also struggling with the continuing daily demands of trying to keep up with high and demanding workloads, and also requiring more time than it was typical to carry out some of their commitments. In some of these responses, participants spoke of a lack of support from institutions to enable them to be able to complete all areas of their academic role, as well as carving out dedicated and protected research time. The majority of respondents were from a higher age bracket, age 40 and over, with over 3/5, 61.4%, between the ages of 40 and 59. A small proportion were under 30 at 2.1%, and 17.1% were 60 or above. One of the limitations we identified in this report is that the call for participants, as Tom noted at the start of this presentation, may have struggled to reach those who tended to be on shorter-term contracts, such as research assistants and research associates. Whilst it is not always the case that these roles are typically performed by younger people, this may mean that some of the younger researchers in the discipline as a whole were not included in the survey. We included questions about sexuality in this survey as a result of findings of Boyle et al. 2021 scoping review, in which they found that none of the studies in the sample focused on the careers and experiences of our LGBTQI colleagues. 81.3% of respondents in our sample reported being heterosexual, 9% preferred not to say, 4.7% were gay or lesbian, 2.9% bisexual, 1.2% queer, and 0.6% in an unlisted category. By university type, our survey indicated there was a slightly lower proportion of heterosexual respondents based in elite and higher tier universities. We did not include many questions which related to social class identity, partly due to some disparities in the determination of social class status as it is enacted within academic research literature. We did ask participants if their parents had a qualification from a higher education institution, which resulted in 52% of participants stating that their parents had not received a higher education qualification. Whilst we cannot situate this data in other HE data, we are made aware by some open answer responses that the effect of coming from a working class background and working in higher education, and there is an example of this in the following slide. We also assessed whether there are associations between perceptions of fair and clear career pathways and personal characteristics of ethnicity, gender, disability, and sexual orientation. In summary, this data suggests that women and those with a disability were less likely to view their institution's academic promotion procedures as fair, or to think that their institution provided a clear pathway to career progression. Those with a disability or condition were also less likely to agree and more likely to disagree that they would be working in education research in 5 years' time, with little difference by gender. The link to sexual orientation here is similar. Care is needed when interpreting this data, given that we know that multiple factors are likely to interact. For example, higher proportions of women are employed at lower tier universities, and both being a woman and being employed at a lower tier institution were in turn related to having more negative career progression experiences. So in the open section parts of the survey, respondents were asked about their thoughts, feelings, and opinions of working in higher education research in the UK in 2022. Here we gained an insight into how personal characteristics, identities, and the intersections between them frame the experiences of those researchers. On the right-hand side here of the slide is a sample of just a few of the additional quotations which came out in these open form questions. It is worth stressing here that this is just a very small sample of the types of responses that we were getting within these open form questions. And I do think there is a lot of area for concern with some of these quotes. I'll give you a couple of seconds to read those. In terms of backgrounds and qualifications, we found that there are different kinds of entry points into working in education research, with researchers coming from different careers and disciplinary backgrounds. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the vast majority had some sort of teaching qualification before entering a career in education research, and approximately 50% of these were working in schools or were largely schools-based. Interestingly, we found that 15% of people working in academia within the sample were also working within other jobs at the same time, a large proportion of these being consultancy work, but also many within third sector and charity roles, additional businesses, and roles related to the specific area of education they taught and researched, like, for example, nursing and healthcare. As we'll explore later in the presentation, these prior career interests and experiences often tie into some of the motivations for conducting research and education and the motivations that participants mentioned having. In elite and higher tier universities, respondents were much more likely to hold doctoral level qualifications at 81.1%, compared with considerably lower figures for middle tier at 66% and lower tier universities at 54.6%. Within the discipline of education, therefore, it's impossible to be involved with research without having completed a doctoral qualification. Universities appear to be accepting of recruiting those without doctoral qualifications. However, while not necessarily a prerequisite to gaining a role in HE, there does appear to be an aspiration to create a doctoral level sector with a high number of staff working towards PhDs, EdDs, or other doctoral level qualifications alongside their current roles. Education research is therefore a patchwork of skills proficiencies, outside working commitments and family or caring responsibilities. Whilst we do not have the data to compare this to any other discipline, it seems particularly interesting that this group within academic research have so many demands on their time, as well as varying degrees of expertise in other related and sometimes not directly related academic and professional disciplines. And so we've come up with a couple of questions that we'd like to pose to you and invite your own questions and comments using these as a starting point. What institutional policies and practices do we have that A, promote inclusion, and B, address inequalities relating to identities and backgrounds? What do we need more and what do we need less of? And how far are these policies that are currently in place creating truly equitable environments within higher education? What are the common uniting experiences and spaces in which interdisciplinary and academic professional knowledge can be exchanged? And I would open the floor to questions and comments.
Okay, so over to us.
We have had a debate here on the group about whether we're best off putting it on people's tables so they can just collect some ideas. Maybe we do that. Okay, so do you want to discuss it with people around your table first and then feedback some observations? Would that be fine? If people can gather their thoughts, if we have a few minutes on that, and then we can move through to the next section. Great. That would be... Thank you. Yeah. You missed it. I've only said it once. Okay, if I could stop you there. Hopefully you've had a chance to gather some... ideas there. As I say, we're going to try and snowball these as we go, and we've got a nice section at the end where we can air some of our thoughts and discuss matters in more detail. So I'm going to move us to the next section on research topics, motivations and methods. starting with some of our findings around motivations. So,
I was just wondering if you wanted any feedback.
yes, please. So we've got a section at the end for discussion and reflection. So the idea is people sort of gather, rather than doing this thing where we front load all our information and then people forget about the first section by the time we get there. So yes, all thoughts we're going to explore at the final section. So in a survey, which was, I think, fair to say, that had some quite troubling sections in, this was, I would definitely pick out as one of the most heartening things to read. There is a real palpable sense that education research matters, it makes a difference, people know exactly what they're researching and why, and could speak at length and did about their motivations. So people often talked about values and ideals, they talked about social justice, they talked about inequalities, they talked about education, knowledge creation and sharing, and much of research was underpinned by these strong values. Many people talked about their specific topic. So we said, why do you research your topic? And they went straight to, I researched this topic because this matters for young people, this matters for society. So they would talk about the value of their topic or their particular specialism within research and the value that that has to the academy and to society. They would often link that to a current or prior job role of what they're trying to achieve. People were working in spaces where they had kind of meaningful work and their research was supportive of that. Many people talked about research itself. People had a very positive experience of doing research when they had time to do it, when they could carve out the space to get it. But in the right conditions, people were saying, actually, research is very developmental. I like working in a collaborative space. I enjoy my research. Some people said, actually, they research for necessity and requirement. It's seen as part of their role as well. And finally, there are a lot of comments in there about people's personal identities and histories and how they came through into why people do research and what topics they covered. So lots of things about their identity as an academic or as an educator, or their kind of ethnic background, cultural background, local backgrounds were coming through very strongly in what people said. So how does this translate into topics that are being studied? One of the things we did in the survey was ask people, in their own words, what do you study? What's your area of research? And we let people sort of self-report that rather than giving them preset categories. We had a very long list of topics being researched, and what you can see here is pretty much the top half of that table, if you like. Again, roughly sorted from your kind of middle prevalence at the bottom up to the highest prevalence at the top. To point out that some of this related to how granular people, how broadly they wanted to define their research focus. There's a lot of things in the bottom half of the table which are a strong kind of specialism with education research, but the kind of more general topics tend to float to the top. I'll give you just 20 seconds to have a look down this list. So, as I say, to some extent this is a grouping thing because lots of things which you'd put, let's say, under social justice were further down the list but as more specialist topics within it. You can see a strong professional learning, teacher education, workforce. You can see policy well represented, as well as focused topics on STEM, EAL, SEND. These are really clear within the makeup. We also asked people at length about different methods that they're using. So what I've done here on this table, and I'll give you a moment to look through it in a bit more detail in a second, is we just looked at the percentage of people who report using different methods. So the column you see on the left, which is high use, is more than 50% of people say they are using this fairly regularly. The one in the middle is a kind of medium use, and the one on the right is a lower use item. So again, I'll give you 30 seconds to take a look. One of the things that struck the team looking through this is the sort of diversity of specialisms. We have a huge coverage of different specialist areas as more general areas of research methods. We were surprised to some extent about even on the lower use categories. These aren't vanishingly small numbers. There are almost 1 in 20 people have used corpus linguistic analysis. We can look through even the lower use categories and say there is a significant critical mass, albeit a small minority, who are using these methods. So we really have a kind of rich set of expertise out there within methods being used. The other thing we looked at within our analysis is we looked back to a survey from the Research Capacity Building Network from 20 years ago and tried to make comparisons. One of the things we did when we designed the survey was explicitly align some of the questions we were asking with this. So what you can see here is a list of methods from the RCBN survey. You can see just one at the bottom, which has increased over the last 20 years, which is the visual and sound sources, we suspect due to availability of audio data and the ability to analyse it. But we actually saw some sizable drops in use of other methods here. So we've got case studies, observations, evaluation, action research, diaries, experiments, longitudinal studies, psychometry, all seeing pretty significant drops over 20 years. So one of the things we want to explore here is how comparable the definition here of discipline is and how this links to the previous survey. So we could follow that as an explanation for these numbers, or it could be something about the change within the discipline itself. So just a few final things on methods. So there's a point to make about diversity, which I've mentioned within methods. Yes, I think that's clearly there. We're not so sure about integration of methods. It's quite a difficult picture to see, but one indicator is that 54% are saying they're doing mixed methods. So by definition, they're using different methods within that. Outside of that, we're not so sure whether these specialist pockets of methods are well connected to each other and whether people are working in silos or working in a inter-method space. So this is one area for consideration. And the other thing we see coming out the qualitative comments is a kind of long tail, if you like, of the paradigm wars still pretty evident. We've got 2 quotations here, but we could pick out another 30 more where people are commenting about qualitative and quantitative research. I'll give you a second to read those quotations. So these are indicative comments of quite a large body of comments of a similar nature and on sort of both sides, if you like. Although we could also pick out many comments about people saying that these are less problematic now than they were. These are long-standing debates, quite clearly. And the final point I'd like to mention is around the training. So there's a very strong view that methodological knowledge is important. This is really clear. Many, roughly 2/3, actively want to develop their methods expertise, but when we ask, are you receiving, what level of training do you believe you've had, about half of colleagues are saying basic, limited, or no research methods training. About a third, 2/5 are saying good, and just 12% are saying they've received an excellent research methods training. Again, we'll stop for a few minutes of reflections on tables. As I say, we will bring these all together in a final discussion. We have a couple of questions here about where are these spaces where disciplines and methods mix? Do we have enough of those, and how can we get them? And then also around the methods training, we've had a conversation about how there's different multiple entry points and a second career nature of the discipline. So is that feeding into problems around targeting methods training? So let's have a few minutes on our tables, gathering reflections. Thanks. Great.
teacher's there. A naughty Sean. Jess, do you mind if I pop this? Is that all right? Just... Okay, everyone. Sorry to interrupt. We'll just take a pause there and hopefully bring these back together when we discuss more at the end. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to move on to the third section from the survey and thinking a little bit about the policy and working conditions that our participants were describing and reporting through their responses. This is a really interesting area, but sort of by its nature, huge. So we're not going through kind of every finite detail, but there is a lot more in the report. And there's also a lot more in terms of how we've broken down some of these findings by different job roles, contracts, universities, etc. as well. But we're just going to share some of the kind of key areas that we hope will stimulate some useful discussions today. We've sort of alluded to some of these figures already, and they've also been kind of connected with Dina and colleagues' work as well. But in terms of contracts and seniority, the majority of our participants in the survey, 62%, were on teaching and research contracts. About a quarter were on teaching and scholarship contracts, and then about 11% on research-only contracts. And we had some really interesting discussions at the beginning of the project when we were designing the survey and thinking about promotion and marketing of the survey. How do we define research and scholarship, and how do we make sure that the survey is as inclusive as possible? Because we really did want to hear from the voices of people who aren't necessarily on the R&T tracks, but who are engaged very meaningfully in research and scholarship work. So we did try and think really carefully about that. And I think in terms of, a quarter of our participants from the teaching and scholarship group, that's good. And their insights have been really invaluable in terms of us thinking about the kind of wider context here. About 84% of our participant group were on permanent contracts, and about half of those who are not on full-time or permanent did state that they would like to be. So there is a group there who aren't or haven't been able to secure permanent contracts, but who are keen to. But there is also a group who are kind of happy, or maybe happy isn't the word, but are kind of satisfied with a part-time or more temporary nature to their work. And we did ask about reasons for that in the survey, which we've reported within the main report as well. In terms of security, though, it's an interesting picture here, though, because we've got, as the bullet point above said, 84% on permanent contracts, but only 56% of participants saying that they feel their job is secure. And this has really encouraged us to think about this kind of nature of security and precarity within the higher education space and what that means, because there are a significant group of people who, despite being on permanent contracts, are sort of worried to some extent about what their job might look like in the future, whether it's going to be there, and what that might mean. We also looked at sort of people's considerations around whether they would be working in HE in the next 5 years. And for those under the age of 60, so for people not necessarily considering retirement imminently, about 62% said that they did expect to be working in HE in 5 years' time, but nearly a quarter said that they were unsure about that. And that's not necessarily, going to translate into a quarter of people leaving within 5 years, but it does suggest that there is, that uncertainty around some people's jobs and roles, and also perhaps the wider sector as well. Pay and promotion came through in a number of areas. We did ask some quite specific questions about it. Nearly 40% of people felt that they were financially well compensated for the work they do. 32% saying they do not. There was a real kind of almost equal sort of spread there across people's responses. Some people sort of feeling a bit unsure in the middle with that response as well. And in terms of promotion procedures, 38% agreeing that their institutional promotion procedures were fair. Those responses were patterned to some extent by the kinds of institutions that people were in. So participants were more likely to report fairness in promotion if they were in the higher tier or elite universities. And there was a few comments about that in the latter sections around the kind of the the procedures and structures that were in place and how well established or not that they were. So that was quite interesting as well. In terms of conditions, so physical safety, 89% of participants reported that they feel physically safe in their working environments. That number was lower for participants from minority ethnic backgrounds and lower again for those people with a disability. It's also worth noting that this survey was kind of done about a year ago. There were still genuine concerns around COVID and the pandemic, and we did see some comments in the final sections around how universities and how leaders and colleagues had supported each other with that as well. When we asked about psychological and mental safety, we can see that the figures are kind of lower in terms of agreement there. So 60% of participants saying that they feel psychologically or mentally safe in their work environment. Nearly 20% disagreed with that statement, which is very concerning and quite stark. Women and minority ethnic participants reporting that they feel less safe. And again, we had some sort of rich qualitative comments coming through about reasons for that. A range of those linked to kind of relationships, job roles there. Nearly 4/5 stated that they were treated with kindness and support by their colleagues, and 65% with fairness and respect. And then we have this topic of workload, which just permeated throughout the whole survey. So wherever there was a place where people could kind of share sort of more in-depth comments, workload was coming through those. And just really sort of genuine concerns about the amount of work that people were being asked to do, the conditions that they were sort of doing that within. And what we sort of saw when we were analysing this was how workload was capturing a sort of broader range of issues here. Again, whether it was about relationships with leaders and other staff, whether it was about the role that they were contracted to do, but the expectations that were actually being placed on them. So quite a lot to kind of get into in a little bit more detail, I think. But over half of our participants felt that they can't complete their work in their contracted hours. 40% feel that their workload was unacceptable. And less than a quarter agreeing that workload was fairly distributed across their departments or schools. And 43% disagreeing with that. So some interesting kind of perceptions and experiences which people did draw on a bit more in the open sections. There's one sort of illustrative quotation here which we've used just to kind of highlight the breadth and variation in the experiences of people working in education, particularly in relation to contracts and working conditions. I'll just give you a few seconds to look at that. And this quotation was also sort of illustrative in many ways of the way that participants, as well as reporting on their own experiences, there was genuine concern for others and the experiences that other colleagues that they knew or were close to had had as well. And we talk a little bit more later about the sort of connectiveness and networks within education, but there is some strength in that, and people were very keen to look at how they could support others there as well. And then we go on to some of the sort of broader policy issues that are talked about a lot when we think about higher education and research. And here we've got this interesting sense from our participants, really, that some of the kind of the policies, the accountability and quality measures that we have in place, many of our participants feel aren't kind of working in the way that they should, or that they're not necessarily conducive to supporting high quality inclusive research. We asked about REF and 13% agreed that REF results are a valid measure of the quality of education research. 40% disagreed with that statement. Interestingly, 56% of education researchers in our sample were not entered for the REF. So we've had some really interesting conversations around how is the REF perceived within the discipline by those who are part of it and are kind of, part of that group, but also by those who are not. And we think that might be an area, a really fruitful area for kind of further discussion and debate as well. In terms of research and autonomy, so 42% agreed that they have enough freedom to pursue their own research agendas. These and some of the comments that we kind of saw on this are really, again, interesting to think about in relation to sort of wider discussions that are happening in relation to universities and freedom of speech and cancel culture and things at the moment. But what really did come through, and Tom and Jess also mentioned this earlier, is that research is a real source of satisfaction for our participants. So again, in the open sections, but also through the kind of more specific closed questions on this, researchers love doing research. They want to do research. They really believe that it has personal value, it seems, but also wider societal, local, regional, and international value as well. So there's, really something to harness there around that sort of satisfaction and the value that it has. But how do we do that within this kind of wider space? And then finally, funding came up as unsurprisingly quite a significant issue for many researchers, but with many reporting that the funding environment was just a huge barrier in terms of the research that they wanted to do or were able to do, but also linked to kind of wider issues of mental health and well-being, the pressures around funding as well. So 9%, just 9%, thought that the process of allocating external research funding was fair. And there, connections were made here with the lack of external research funding and perceptions around, certain groups or certain methodological areas being favoured in terms of being allocated that funding as well. There were also some comments around kind of shifts in terms of where research is happening. We know education research happens beyond universities as well, so some of the other organisations involved in that. We are aware that there is relatively low external research income in education, so 55 million in 2021 compared with 58 million in 2014. And those of you who were at BERA last year, David James did a really interesting discussion around that in terms of the REF findings and what that means. And he described this funding picture extremely low compared with public expenditure on education more broadly, and made a really interesting comparison with healthcare, which proportionally gets quite a bit more funding for research. So that's where we are there. A couple of, again, sort of indicative quotations here. I'll just give you a few seconds there, but these just draw on some of these issues around performance, accountability, quality in the sector as well. So some varying views there from our participants, and there were many more that were shared. And it was really interesting to see the kind of the thought and care that people had put into sharing some of these experiences of their individual work, but also of higher education and education research more generally. And again, we report some of these in more detail in the main report. So just to kind of draw this section to a close, there's a couple of key questions that we've come up with here. You might have other thoughts as well, but what are the causes of the unevenness in working conditions and what can be done about them? So our findings suggest that some people are having a good time, they're having a positive time within education research, they like what they're doing and they're treated well. Others, again, as we saw from the first presentation, that is perhaps less the case. What can we do there? But also, how can we develop a funding environment for educational research that is perhaps more positive than it is now? And I'll leave that with you for 5 minutes. Sorry, Tom.
We've probably got about 15 minutes left here, so I wonder whether we have reflections from Emma and then we can open up the discussion.
Yep.
Because that's just in terms of using the time.
Okay, thanks Becky, Tom, Jess. So they've given me the job of trying to sum it all up and offer some kind of personal reflections. I guess from my experience as a very recent head of department, and apparently because I've been around for a while, although they didn't phrase it quite like that. So just kind of drawing some of the ideas together. So I suppose, and I don't want to kind of, talked about this a lot already, I don't want to labour this too much, the idea that education is an atypical workforce compared with the rest of higher education. We are less diverse than other disciplines. It's interesting some of the discussion about what law, social work looks like and how we compare to that, the extent to which perhaps it's a reflection on movement into the discipline from teaching, or the fact that a lot of education research takes place in departments of psychology, sociology, economics, law, health sciences and so on. You know, that may change the diverse profile, it may not. But I guess the point is, regardless of the reasons, there are issues that have come up through this survey about the progression of people from perhaps certain BAME backgrounds, and I think that's an area of concern that I think we should all be concerned about, regardless of perhaps about how they get there, in terms of the progression through the promotions, but also their sense of feeling safe and secure at work and being treated with fairness and respect by colleagues. Another sort of theme that comes to mind is the extent to which there is a common experience of higher education. I think it's the case that there's less precarity in education compared with other areas of higher education, where maybe around 40% of people are on insecure contracts, particularly in the sciences. I mean, that may be a reflection perhaps about the fact that, you know, they're not linked to the large research grants as they might be in the sciences. So these are perhaps less common within education, although they do exist. And again, that may in turn be a function of the way that education research is funded, and perhaps what we can see about perhaps less large grants, large research projects being funded within education. Regardless about the kind of perhaps slightly positive focus about lack of precarity, you know, the large number of people on permanent contracts, it's still extent that there are concerns about job security. This may potentially be linked to those working within ITE, a reflection perhaps of the the market review, and also perhaps a reflection on, arguably, at least from the way that I can see it in terms of recruitment, of the home market to undergraduate programs in education studies. You know, that kind of decline, particularly in the home market. Perhaps overseas students, the market is perhaps a little bit more buoyant, but falling numbers of students interested in studying education studies as an academic subject at undergraduate level. Another point of reflection is, of course, in early career researchers and the diversity of the early careers researcher population, where they come from and how they progress into, you know, more secure contracts. I think this is perhaps a particular concern in education, given that quite a lot of people enter from teaching and from other professions, and it's a risk moving into education and academia from perhaps a teacher leadership profession, where you might take salary cuts, the initial contracts may be less secure, and, you know, what can we do, you know, to help with that sort of transition? And I think that's an area that perhaps, you know, in terms of the precarity of early career researchers, regardless of where they're coming from, is something that perhaps we might want to think about. Workload, as Becky said, is a perennial issue. I'm not going to go on about workload here. Heads of department, you live and breathe this every day. I guess perhaps one thing to consider perhaps is about expectations and people's expectations of their workload, and how we manage those sorts of expectations in terms of supporting people to manage their workload, and how much time is realistic and reasonable to spend on particular tasks, and, you know, what role can heads of departments provide here. That there's a set amount of work that needs to be done, you know, and how do we ensure that it's distributed fairly, equitably, but also that people are supported to actually do the work. Another area is, of course, ref and research, and I perhaps looking back over maybe the last 10 years, and I think one of the biggest changes to people's working lives since, or perhaps before ref 2014, has been the move or increased use of teaching-focused contracts, and what that means particularly for progression. I think that the data that we have shows that those who are the most happiest are those on research-focused contracts, but they're also the less secure in their roles. But thinking perhaps in particular about issues of progression for those on teaching-focused contracts, where it can be perhaps less obvious, less clear about how you support people. It's not about publishing in the right journal, getting the particular grant, and how both departments and also the institution can support that. And I think some institutions are better at doing this than others, where they hold teaching and research in equal esteem. And I think that's a really important factor in terms of supporting progression for those on teaching-focused contracts. Methods is, of course, a perennial issue. One I'm particularly interested in. My first academic job was on the RCB, and I don't know if any of you remember, the Teaching and Learning Research Project funded this huge sort of initiative into kind of methods and building capacity in methods, in research methods, and it's been interesting to reflect what has changed in the last 20 years. Probably not a huge amount. I think research methods training is probably better. I think the methodological schism is alive and well, and the world still largely consists of those who do numbers and those who don't do numbers, and I think we've not moved really to bridging that gap a great deal. Personally, I think that initiatives like the Nuffield-funded Q-STEP have not really helped. I think that they're aimed to sort of, introduce those who have perhaps been less reluctant to use numbers in their research to using numbers. I don't think that's been successful. I think, personally, that, it's really involved people teaching stats, people who will find stats easy, teaching stats to people who find stats easy. And I don't think that's really helped. And I think education, along with other social sciences, has not benefited as it might have done from those huge funded initiatives. I think one thing that came through quite clearly in the survey is that people are interested in learning about methods. We really do use a diverse range of methods. People are interested in learning about methods, but research methods training, in the views of many of the respondents, is still not great. So there's potentially still more work to do around that. And then a few other thoughts in terms of collaboration and engagement. I think as a discipline, we're very much engaged with policymakers, with practitioners, with practice. There's strong networks, but perhaps less strong networks of education researchers working with each other. Professional organisations and BERA and so on do a good job of that. But what more can be done to get people to talk to each other about their research? We do exist along with other areas of HE in quite a challenging policy context. IT reform is specific to this area, but challenges of funding, the challenges of REF, and of course industrial action are something that is kind of are live issues within schools and departments of education. I wanted to finish on something quite positive. I think it's quite heartening from reading the responses to the survey, to doing some of the analysis, to see that as a discipline there's a strong sense of commitment among colleagues to research, to learning more about doing research, to communicating our research, and that sort of idea of a strong sense of the social benefit of doing education research. And I think it was quite heartening to see that. So I think in conclusion, it's a mixed picture. I mean, some of this will not surprise you. There's work there about sort of precarity, people or lack of job security, people's sense of self, people's sense of, being safe and respected within the workplace, the diversity of the field, and also, of course, positives in terms of, people's commitment to doing education research and education as a research as for the common good. So that's me. More questions. We come with a lot of questions. No answers. Lots of questions. So here are some more questions about, what is the state of the discipline, which I think are the kind of fundamental questions that I guess the separate research projects have sought to find out. We have a list of more questions, but I think we've given you enough. It's 15:15. So I'm going to hand over to Tom, who apparently is in charge for today.
We need to hand the mic out.
Or hand the mic for any questions. But thank you.
So, not just questions, just comments, statements, anything people want to say. If we can keep it fairly succinct, we'll hear from more people and we'll hear about more topics. So, put your hands up if you want to talk about anything we've raised.
I think we need to speak into the microphone as well, so it can be recorded. One over there, Ash as well. We're going to feed back on the table discussion we had. I hope that's okay.
Yes.
On the first one, we thought that there are some ways in which ESRC fellowships, actually it's not the first one, it's the second one. No, on the first one, which was to do about conditions of work, we think that teaching only and research only career paths are really destructive and don't help. We're quite interested in terms of what you were saying about the proportion who are on teaching and research, but we wonder if you cut that, notionally speaking, people who are preparing trainee teachers are on teaching and research contracts. In practice, they can't often take up the possibilities of doing research. And the other thing is, we think mentoring as well as contract management in departments is absolutely key, and that mentoring needs to include how you move from a teaching commitment to research and vice versa. And the other points that we wanted to make was about the benefits of the kind of ESRC fellowships there are to encourage people from education to, for instance, go and spend time in the DFE, so that actually people wise up about the policy environment. And that in terms of methods training, we think borrowing best practice from the States would really help. They do a much better job in the States on doctoral courses of actually preparing people for research active careers. Plus, we also think we need to substantially improve methods training at MA.
If we keep this in the audience, I can respond, but I think it's better if we hear from other people.
Thanks. Also on the topic of the first one, I was talking to Andy about the issue of neurodiversity that came up in one of the quotes, whereby one member of staff said about being neurodiverse and not having anyone understand how they think differently. And I think we talk a lot about in our departmental meetings about how there's so much support to study for the students that we teach, but there's zero support for neurodiverse staff in terms of like extensions for fulfilling deadlines or doing marking and stuff like that. So.
And what we had within the survey as well was a quite expansive definition where we said any form of disability, impairment or condition that affects your everyday work, and we deliberately tried to broaden out that, because the HESA figures, it's a much smaller percentage. I think it's about 15% of people were saying, you know, I've got some kind of additional kind of need or experience. So there's a significant group here, and we really need to know more about them.
Thanks. I was curious about the research methods training side, and I agree with points made already about the need to constantly be improving, need for mentorship and so on. But presumably, so one of the success stories of education is the number of doctorates apparently that we produce, teach, support, turn out. Now, those people, of course, they have to do some sort of methods training as part of the doctorates, and so I'm quite curious about what it is particularly that's they don't regard as satisfactory, basically, do they? I'm assuming, you know, from my experience, I can think of some of the things that might not be satisfactory, but I would assume that every education research department has a research methods training element. So it must be in the detail, mustn't it, in the different institutional practices, I guess. And that would be an area that I think an organisation, for example, like BERA, could think about, could maybe engage with institutions, with people like yourselves here today, and sort of ask questions of what is it like in different institutions, what are the challenges. There's bound to be, I would assume, in some places, actually a lack of expertise in a particular way, particular method or a particular way of thinking. Well, that's the perfect opportunity for what you were also saying about the need for collaboration. Emma, I think you were saying the need for collaboration within education and across institutions. Just something that occurred to me there.
Can I add to that? I completely agree about the the different types of methods training that happens. And I think that on the ground it's probably quite different in different types of institutions depending on resources. You know, some institutions may offer doctoral training alongside their ESRC DTP, and they may fold in all students regardless of whether they're on a research council scholarship, but in other institutions it may be very separate. So I think there will be a diversity of methods training, and I really think that's something that would be interesting for Beirut to explore. And the reason why it may be different in different departments is down to resources and how well the departments can resource that. You know, methods training can be, you can spend all 3 years learning about methods. So it's, you know, I think that would be a really interesting thing for Beirut to explore.
One reflection from me on this is that there's almost a need to map hot and cold spots, as it were, by career stage, by different entry points. I think, as someone who teaches quite a bit of research methods, I think one of the issues is that the diversity of the different methods is actually one of the issues, that you have only so much time and you're covering so much so quickly, and people are coming from very different disciplinary backgrounds as well. So you end up, you know, with a few weeks for this and 2 weeks for that and 1 week for that. And how do we get this general but actually spaces where people can get to the real specialism that they need? I think that's part of the question here.
But I also do wonder how far education researchers see themselves as part of the broader social sciences. Yeah. NCRM does offer methods training, and the doctoral schools are meant to, but how much do education researchers participate in those kinds of events? I think that's a good question for the discipline.
Yeah.
Sorry, just on that, in our little table discussion, we were also talking a bit about the research methods training, but not about that for doctoral researchers or early career, but the kind of like ongoing professional development and research training throughout your career, and how it can be a challenge sometimes to pick that up. So it links into the workload question a little bit, as I'm sure everything does. But yeah, about capacity really to have sessions within departments or across departments that focus on research methods in intellectually interesting ways that isn't, here's a workshop about how to get a grant, or here's a workshop about how to write a referable paper, or, you know, sort of things associated with those kinds of outputs. So that's something else that I think BERA might want to think about and look at. So
I think there's something very much to be said about learning kind of on the job. I mean, I reflect on my own career, and I think some of the best training I've had was just being on larger projects with really experienced people. I personally been very privileged to have that space to learn methods, and I think for other people it's harder. One of the ways we posed this as a question at the end of those slides is, what are these spaces in which people can sort of mingle and share and knowledge exchange between different areas? And I think that's part of it too. And maybe we go within grants looking at how other researchers are supported to develop methodological expertise is part of the solution.
Yeah, and sorry to mention the paradigm wars, but I do think it's unhelpful if people take a sort of one side good, one side bad, because it precludes you from having an open mind and going, well, I don't personally naturally feel I'm good, say, with statistics, but I want to know more. And the opposite, actually. You know, I'm good with numbers, but actually I'd like to know a lot more about how people who, say, analyse qualitative data, how do they do it? So I do think, and Emma, we did actually argue in the introduction to the BERA handbook that we thought to some degree those debates had gone away. So, you know, I mean, I think it's evenly balanced in the survey data, isn't it? I mean, but it still clearly matters to some people.
Can I just say something quickly on that? I agree with you. I thought that had finished. But I think maybe the use of more complex stats and the kind of promotion of more complex modelling kind of possibly puts people off. And it's that middle ground of doing good quality descriptive data, descriptive analysis, where you don't need to be a statistician to do it. I think sometimes that's the sort of the stool that people might fall through. And I sometimes think reviewers of journal articles might not help. Why have you not used multi-level modelling? Why have you not used more complex forms of analysis, when actually straightforward basic political arithmetic is all you need, and which, you know, everybody who's done primary school maths can do. And I think that's the kind of area that's often missed out when we talk about using numbers. You know, we're not rushing to do the complex stuff. It's not necessarily better.
I get on my hobby horse and will stop.
Just on that point, Anne, I mean, I'm probably slightly closer to quants than qual, but I'm not a cutting-edge statistician. But I think there's a duty on people who do use those complex multi-level models and those complex quantitative methods. There should be a real duty on them about making their findings easily understandable to a broad audience. And I'm sure we've all been in sessions where we've seen loads of complex numbers on tables with limited explanations about what the hell X, Y, and Z are. Yeah. And I think that the more that the quants are made clear to broad audiences, I think the better. Yeah.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
And sorry, just to say on that, I think that's something that we and Dina's team have thought quite carefully about in the presentation of our findings from this work, because we really did want the whole discipline to be able to engage with this study and that one as well. And so, yeah, I mean, our presentation of statistics in this report is what some people might describe as quite simple. We haven't used multi-level models or anything because we determined that it wasn't necessary for the messages and the headlines that we wanted to convey. So, yeah, there is an onus on us as researchers to think about what's necessary in order to answer our questions, I guess. Yeah.
I think it's helpful also to see the other side of the coin here, that we need, you end up with this conversation getting into the statistics, but actually I think there's a conversation needed about theoretical sophistication of quantitative research, that there's a lot that qualitative researchers have to say about some of those areas, and having worked on some mixed methods projects, you can see how powerful it is when we put those together. So I think actually helping, it's both sides of it, and as I say, we've got to be careful not to say, you know, these people who aren't using quant should be. I think it's the other way around. It's both ways, isn't it? I think we've finished our time slot here.
I think we have. Everyone's like, it's lunchtime. Come on. Yeah.
Great.
We'll wrap up there, but thank you very much.
Yes, thank you so much.